Croeso nôl, welcome back to ADREF, the End Youth Homelessness Cymru podcast. We're really excited to be coming back to you with episode 2 of the podcast and talking to you about neurodiversity and youth homelessness. Not only have we been working a lot on this topic over the past couple of years, but it's also one that has a lot of personal significance to us as a team. We are 2/3 majority neurodivergent disabled team, so it's something that we all kind of have the personal interest in as well as a professional one.
Thank you, Beth. This really was a fantastic episode to get out, and the research is obviously one that we're also passionate about in the team. As you said, we've been working on this for about 3 years now. It initially came about as an area that we felt required further research, as a number of frontline workers, youth homeless coordinators from across Wales came to us and had noticed this anecdotal evidence of the overrepresentation of neurodivergent young people, or young people with neurodivergent traits perhaps, coming into contact with the system. And there was this feeling that there was this overrepresentation there, but also then that this group of young people were potentially further disadvantaged once they came into contact with the system, because of the way our systems are structured with the neurotypical brain in mind. That's kind of where the motivation for the research came about, and as you said, we've been working on this over the past 3 years. We recruited and trained 4 neurodivergent young people who unfortunately had experience of youth homelessness to come on board as peer researchers. And by peer researchers, I mean that we trained them in conducting research, conducting interviews, conducting focus groups, ethics, and really from the outset sat down with them and just discussed what was important to them, set the parameters of the research, and allowed them to decide not only what they wanted to research, but also how they wanted to do it. It's been something I've certainly learned a lot from myself, and it's a piece of research that we're also passionate with and about. And since we launched it about a year ago in WID, which is a LGBTQ+ neurodivergent friendly community library in Cardiff, and then again in the Senedd, we've continued to try and roll out the research through workshops, presentations, talks, and we're really excited to bring the findings of this research and this conversation to the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. What's really exciting as well is that one of the fantastic peer researchers who worked on this research, Axe, is part of the conversation. They've been involved with EYHC since this research first started, like 3 years ago, and they're still really involved with us today. You can hear directly from them about their experience of homelessness, but also of working as a peer researcher and of kind of finding ways out of that, as well as a chat with one of the frontline workers who was one of the first people to kind of notice this issue and bring it to EYHC, as well as our EYHC colleague, Sean, who knows an awful lot about neurodivergence, disability, especially in a kind of legislative and political context. We had a really interesting conversation, and hopefully you'll enjoy listening to it. Welcome to the End Youth Homelessness Cymru podcast. I'm your host, Beth. Today we're going to be talking about a really important topic, which is neurodiversity and youth homelessness. If you've been following our work, you'll know that this is an issue we covered in our report called Impossible to Navigate Youth Homelessness Through the Lens of Neurodiversity. If you're interested, you can read the full report over on our website, which is www.endyouthhomelessness.cymru. I've got some fantastic guests with me today to discuss this topic. So firstly, we've got Nic Davies, who is the Youth Homeless Coordinator for Caerphilly. Nicola was heavily involved in the research, and as a neurodivergent person herself, is all too aware of how hard it can be to support neurodivergent young people within the constraints of the current housing and homelessness system and how it's set up. So Nicola, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Beth, and I'm really looking forward to today. And again, for me personally, but also for me as working within the field, it's been a really important piece of research.
Well, we appreciate you joining us today, Nicola. I'm also joined by Axe, who was one of the peer researchers who worked on the report, and as a neurodivergent young person who has had some experiences of homelessness perspective is so valuable. So thank you for joining us, Axe.
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to getting the word out more about this project. It's meant a lot to me, and it's been really quite inspiring seeing how much traction it's getting and how much these issues are being talked about.
Thank you, Ax. Yeah, it's been brilliant to have you involved. And I'm also joined by my EYHC colleague, Sean Bendel. Sean is the Senior Research and Policy Officer for EYHC and previously worked at Disability Wales, so has got an extensive knowledge of the kind of legislative and policy context around neurodiversity and disability more broadly. So, Sean, thank you for being here. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your role at EYHC?
Yeah, sure thing. It's great to be on the podcast. My role largely focuses around driving the sort of research agenda within EYHC, but also a lot of the policy side, which is the stakeholder engagement. So going out, speaking to policymakers, speaking to people working in government roles within other third sector partners, and when I say government roles, I mean at all levels as well. So that could be local, Welsh, or UK, to really get EYHC's aims on the agenda to become talking points to actually make policy out of them.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, thank you all for joining me today. It's really great to have you. So let's get started. I'd like to start by asking you, Sean, about the kind of definition of neurodiversity and the importance of using the right language when we talk about it.
Yeah, sure. So when you're talking about neurodiverse and neurodivergent, a lot of things, people often get confused about, are these terms interchangeable? And they're not. So if you're talking about neurodiversity exists within a population. So it's about the different ways of people's thinking, the different ways their brain works. And no two people are going to be exactly the same in that sense. So any group of people is neurodiverse. Neurodivergence specifically refers to people who fall within the neurodivergent category of diagnoses. So usually that means autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, among others, and obviously doesn't always require a diagnosis, as we'll get on to talk about later. And then you have neurotypical, where people are considered to have typical or normal cognitive functions. You can have a debate about how useful that way of thinking is, but that's broadly speaking what we're talking about.
Fab. Okay. And in the report, the research looks at neurodiversity or neurodivergence through the social model of disability. So can you explain what that means for anyone who might not know?
Yeah, so taking this back a few steps from the specific, as we were just talking about, social model of disability was a model developed in the 1970s by disabled people for disabled people. And it sort of sits in opposition to the medical model. And the medical model of disability really focuses on what's wrong with the individual, and its real aims are how to cure or fix that individual. The social model, on the other hand, looks at people as being disabled by society around them. So it's based off those negative attitudes, misconceptions, and societal barriers. The easiest way to think about this is if you're trying to go into a shop and you might be a wheelchair user, if that shop doesn't have a ramp, it's not that you can't get into the shop, it's that there's no way for you to get into the shop. But if the shop has a ramp, you can go in and use it just the same way as any other shopper would. And that's kind of the way it thinks about it. It's about removing those barriers within society to allow disabled people to have the same level of access to services and the environment around them as a non-disabled person. And I think that's the other key thing with the social model of disability, is it relies on language quite a lot. So it is a identity first language. So it's disabled person, not person with disability. Again, you can have debates about that. I wouldn't go, if somebody says I'm a person with disability, I wouldn't so much correct them. But generally speaking, if you're writing about this, or more broadly, the disabled community prefers disabled person. So what we're talking about there is obviously neurodivergence sits under this broad definition of disability, that there are tasks in the day-to-day life of someone who would consider themselves neurodivergent that are made harder both by the environment around them, societal barriers and attitudes that make it harder for them to engage in day-to-day life. So when the report says it's using the social lens, it's looking at it from that perspective. It's not looking at what's wrong with the individual. It's looking at what barriers in society stop that individual from engaging fully. And in this case, it's engaging with the housing and homelessness system. So it starts at that housing end. What barriers are there to neurodivergent young people engaging with and maintaining a tenancy, all the way through to what barriers are there, engaging with the homelessness system, and then getting back on your feet and into stable accommodation again. And that's kind of how we've looked at this.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a really, really good explanation. I think for me personally, I know that as a neurodivergent person, when I first encountered the concept of the social model, it really did change my perspective on myself and my own experiences. And I wonder if you guys, Nicola and Axe in particular, have any kind of reflections on how thinking about neurodivergence in that way has impacted you personally.
I do think that the social model is something that fits much more into it, because you can be, we are all functioning in work, in college, in uni, in whichever environment that we're in that. But there are struggles and there are issues within those type of environments. And again, when you're thinking about the social model and how your interactions with the environment, with expectations, with policies, and all of those things, how that impacts on you, and it can have massive repercussions for you, for both positive and negative. But the social model for me is like really important, which is why I don't ask for somebody that's got a diagnosis or not. It's about that social model and perceived social model and how they perceive themselves within that. I think it's really important for me anyway. And in our project, that's something that we're not asking for anybody with a diagnosis.
The concept is new to me. Like, obviously, as I was going through this project, I learned all these new terms, things like that. And it's important to me because that way of thinking, it doesn't put the blame on the individual for just existing, which a lot of society seems to do, is sort of, you need to change this thing about you because we don't like it. Whereas this is identifying that the individual is not the problem. The neurodiversity is never an issue. Being neurodivergent isn't a problem. It is the environment around that is the problem. And yeah, the ability to be a part of this project, despite my lack of diagnoses, because when I joined the project, I wasn't diagnosed with Tourette's. I'm still not diagnosed with autism, but it shouldn't take a diagnosis, and it's so much more difficult because it's so much more difficult to diagnose, that we should be offering support and treatment regardless, really. Like, with my more physical, I mean, the Tourette's is a physical issue, but with my physical health issues, I was diagnosed almost immediately because I was pretty much in a crisis by the time I was seen to. And it shouldn't take a crisis anyway, but it especially shouldn't take a crisis with neurodivergent people. And it can sometimes. It could be, sometimes you only think someone's neurodivergent because they're having a meltdown or a tic attack or something like that. And that's the only point where we're like, fine, we'll give you help. It should be available so much sooner. And just, this is such a better way of seeing it, that we can get that help sooner. In fact.
Absolutely, yes. So one of the things that the report talks about is the everyday challenges that the neurodivergent young people faced, which is by no means a comprehensive list of, some of the challenges that they might face. But Sean, would you mind just kind of telling us a little bit about that element of the report?
Yeah, so when we were talking about the everyday challenges, this was very much led by the young people involved in the research. So this isn't to say that, we've just talked about how the social model says that we're not there to diagnose and medicalize people, but these are the issues that the young people wanted highlighted to people who would be reading this report. So part of it is to do with emotions and the way that those may be displayed and how those young people understand those emotions. So basically not expecting the same emotional reaction out of every single person. Social interactions is another one. Maintaining eye contact, I think, is one of those big ones that really bugs neurodivergent people. It doesn't make much sense why it's such a defining social norm, but often is seen as impolite if you don't. And then I think another one on that sort of same area, around communication, is just about following flows of conversation and things like that. So don't assume someone's being rude. Just go with it and understand that, they're just interpreting that conversation in a different way to what you are. sensory issues, and these are the sort of classic ones, the sounds, lights, textures, smells, etc., that can be overwhelming to people, and people might react to in a way that's unexpected. And again, this is one of those ones that's perhaps a little more understandable. Everyone's like, oh, I don't particularly like a very brightly lit room, perhaps, or I don't particularly like this type of food. And it's kind of just thinking about it in that way, but it might be a more intense sensation for some people. And the sort of final one is around what's we've sort of termed in the report cognitive function. So that's around things like people's attention span and their focus, and organization and things like that, where people might find it a little difficult to stay on top of some of these things. And again, it's not to assume that this person's doing that deliberately. There is a genuine thing there, but it does make it a little more difficult for them. And again, this is one of those things where, small strategies can make people's lives a hell of a lot easier when it comes to overcoming some of these barriers. So I think that's the key thing that this report tries to get across as well.
Brilliant, yeah. So Axe and Nicola, what do those kind of challenges, is that something that you face in your everyday lives? Are there other challenges that maybe aren't highlighted in the report? What does that kind of mean for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, even like in the 12 minutes we've been doing this now, I've gotten distracted by something several times and had to tune back into the conversation to try and keep track. Not because I don't want to pay attention, but because I'm trying to focus on too many things at once. For me, a lot of the day-to-day issues are either sort of social or sensory. I'm in a medical environment a lot of the time, and a lot of neurodivergent people I know don't do well in a medical environment because there's bright fluorescent lights, there's constantly an alarm somewhere. Personally, I'm up in a dialysis unit 3 times a week, surrounded by machines and, again, bright lights, lots of people. It gets very overwhelming very consistently. And a lot of people adapt to it. It's overwhelming the first week or two, but they get used to it. You tune out the beeping, all that. I don't. It's overwhelming every time, and it's not likely to get better. It's just how it is, essentially. And there's ways I adapt. There's ways I bring my headphones, I bring a soft blanket to sort of, have something to fidget with. But yeah, even my everyday, although abnormal, is overwhelming sometimes. And then socializing, I can be quite blunt sometimes, or I have to pay a lot of attention to what I'm saying so that I don't sound too blunt, or so I'm not talking too long, things like that. It's a lot to think about, even just the little things. It's everyday issues that add up and don't necessarily get easier sometimes, even if you use all the coping strategies in the world, all the accommodations. Sometimes things are just difficult, but then sometimes it's hard to even get those accommodations. So it's about finding a balance in how you do things and what works for you, surrounding yourself with the right people as much as you can.
Yeah. So for me, it's organizational. It's something that over time I've learned ways and means around managing things myself. By no means am I got on top of it by anything in the imagination. Things like people within my team, I give them absolute permission to poke me with a big stick if I need to do things at particular times or remind me. I absolutely welcome reminders and things like that, because I will be hyper focused on something, zone out on other things, and it's stuff like that. So it's about finding methods and things around you. Some of the stuff, when I'm thinking about some of the young people I've worked with, is if you give me a date, if I haven't written that date down, it will be gone then later. So if somebody says, come, you've got an appointment at 12 o'clock on Friday, if somebody's might not have nudged me, then, and people, you're thinking, you spent ages trying to get them an appointment somewhere like CAMS or some, might have spent 2 months doing that, and then they've not turned up. And it's not because they haven't wanted to, it's because it's literally gone. It's gone out of their head. And it's those type of things that in the past you would have been called lazy for it. It's okay if you've got support systems in place for that. It's when they're not there, which is why you can't leave it up to individuals. You have to have systems within organizations that can make sure that those support systems are in place, isn't there?
100%. I think for me personally, again, starting to look at it through the social model changes my perspective. And I think for such a long time, like you used the word lazy then, and I think it's like it was like a stick I beat myself with, you know. I'd constantly internalize it and be like, my God, what is wrong with me? Why am I so lazy? Why can't I do these things? But actually, if I have the right support, the right systems around me, I'm more than capable of doing them. So that was really well put. Thank you, Nicola.
A lot of pain to get there sometimes, isn't there? People don't know the pain behind the understand. I'm at an understanding part, but there's a lot of pain to get there sometimes, you know.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the kind of biggest reasons really that this report happened in the first place was because you and some other like frontline workers in similar positions to yourself were coming to us at EYHC and saying, we are seeing so many neurodivergent young people come through our services. No one's talking about it. We don't know if we're supporting them correctly. We need some help with this. So can you kind of tell us a little bit about what it was that made you want to kind of push for this research to happen?
Yeah, so two things. I mean, there was things were happening a little bit like people are not turning up for meetings, people are not, we were just like, what is, what's going on? And just kept starting to see it. And then when you sort of, again, because I have an interest in it, because I am neurodivergent, then I think I will maybe look and find out if there is something like that going on. What's the reason that maybe somebody's not engaging? And it kept coming through all the time. So thinking, is it just me because I'm picking up on it, or is there like a lot more young people involved in this? When it was just, I kept saying to people, how many people have you got? And asking questions, so I'd speak to my team and I'd say, well, how many people do you know have got like maybe ADHD or dyslexia or so? We were just having initial anecdotal conversations in the background. And then I can remember like working then we had an all Wales meeting and it got brought up there. And then like my colleague Faye from Conway, and I know Faye has been hugely heavily involved as well. And again, Faye is actually neurodiverse herself, and I think that's what I like about it, is come from the field itself. We had like a bit of a side discussion about it as she identified things as well. So, and again, obviously then those conversations happened then with Bill and with the End Youth Homelessness Cymru, and it was really then from there it was sort of aligned. But again, this was really quite innovative as well, and the approach, it was because it was led by lived experience young people and took lived experiences young people's perspectives as part of it. It wasn't like just research based on what's out there already. It was much more powerful. So for us, it was initially anecdotal, and I kept thinking, there really needs to be something. And when those conversations, I was like, I really need to be a part of this. For me, it was like fantastic aligning of all these stars and things coming together at the right time.
Thank you, Nic. Yeah, so Sean, the research finds that neurodivergent young people are actually overrepresented within the homelessness population. Why is that, do you think?
I think the first thing to acknowledge is that the data isn't really great on the number of young people who are neurodivergent in the homelessness population, and some of the estimates vary pretty wildly. I think it's hard to ignore, as Nic was just saying, the growing feeling, especially among frontline staff, that this is becoming a much more prevalent issue that has to be addressed, and that partly led into this research. What our research sort of tells us about why neurodivergent young people specifically who end up becoming homeless, part of that is to do with family breakdown, and this is the most common issue which drives forward all forms of youth homelessness. So this isn't just something that's particularly prevalent for neurodivergent people. It is the main driver, but there are other things which make it further complicated for neurodivergent young people. And a lot of this falls back to the levels of support that these young people get in their lives, be that directly to do with housing, or it could be through school, through the health system, and much more. So what we found is a lot of families where not only is a young person neurodivergent, but perhaps the parents are or a sibling is, adds extra strain on that family. So you're talking about a family that may have multiple generations of undiagnosed neurodivergence in the family. There isn't enough support, and that's going to put strain. Like, if you're not getting the help that you need to be blunt about it, it's going to lead to conflict in the family home. And this isn't to say neurodivergent parents are bad parents at all. We never say that. What we're saying is that if somebody is struggling, and it could be the young person that's struggling and the parent is struggling to support them because there is no additional support wrapped around that family that they need, and that leads to the conflict, which can unfortunately lead to family breakdown. Equally, we've seen a lot of situations where it's a neurodivergent young person living in a neurotypical household where they sadly do face ableism within that setting. And that can lead to them being misunderstood. And a lot of young people sort of described that they felt like the black sheep of the family. So you're in a situation where perhaps the parents don't understand them, they're not getting the support they need from elsewhere. And this can be traumatic for the young person. And that can be a whole other range of issues stemming from that. And this is coupled with, the lack of understanding in the family home. And that can lead to the young person sadly being asked to leave the family home or choosing to leave the family home because of the pressure that they're under. And I think that's something that we're keen to emphasize, especially in these circumstances, is that it is really about the wraparound of support that isn't there for the families, and that really needs to change in the long run. Secondly, you have a lot of issues around foster placement breakdown. So a lot of these can be quite similar to the wider family breakdown issues, where there's not enough support around the family, which makes it a lot harder to support that young person. But also, if you're in a situation where we know there are very high indices of people leaving the foster care system and going into homelessness, and you just chuck the fact that there's neurodivergence there, they're not just exiting foster care into the housing wider world without the fallback that many young people have. A lot of young people can choose to move back home. If you're in a foster care setting, that's not always available to you. It's much less likely to be available to you, in fact. And if you chuck that neurodivergence on top of that, so the world isn't built to accommodate you either, that's going to further complicate it. And sadly, we do see stories from some of the young people we spoke with that some people who are supposed to be their carers, their parents, in a lot of cases, see it as a job rather than as a caring vocation. They don't necessarily see themselves as a parent to the young person or a caregiver to the young person. That's what they do for a living. Once you add the complications that this young person might need a little bit of extra support, it becomes even more likely that relationship breaks down and they're asked to leave the foster placement. And finally, the research talked about just difficulty maintaining a tenancy. Now, again, I think anybody who rents at the moment or is looking to move on to the property ladder knows it's difficult, especially for a younger person. So I think that is further complicated when a neurodivergent young person, especially if they've come out of the foster care system, especially, maybe hasn't had the chance to develop those skills needed to maintain a tenancy, coupled with the fact that, system for maintaining a tenancy isn't necessarily the most neurodivergent friendly in the world. If there's a lot of remembering times, remembering appointments, remembering to pay the electric bill, remembering to pay the rent on time, and people can be quite unforgiving in these circumstances, and I think that quite often leads to conflict and breakdown in relationships through that route. And you can add on top of this, as we talked about earlier, when people become overwhelmed and may express their emotions in different way, these are misinterpreted, and some of the research talked about people being seen as naughty or angry, unfairly so, just because this is how they experience the world around them. And that's going to add pressure in these situations where it's going to be harder to maintain a good quality tenancy for that neurodivergent young person, pushing them again towards homelessness.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. That was very comprehensive. Ax, why do you think that, just kind of based on obviously your own experience and what you've seen, why do you think neurodivergent young people might be overrepresented within the homeless population?
I mean, Sean thoroughly covered everything that was in the report, but yeah, I mean, personally, most of the people I've spoken to and myself, it was an issue of family breakdown. That seems, at least in my circles, most common. Like with me, it was an issue with my mum. She wasn't getting the support she needed. I wasn't getting the support I needed. So we had to I had to leave for a while. Thankfully, we've been able to repair our relationship since, but it caused a lot of issues. It caused an argument that was frankly quite traumatic and should never have had to happen. And there had been attempts to sort of get us both help before, but things don't last. The help that's offered isn't, it's never long enough. It's always 6 weeks of counselling or 8 weeks of this person coming and helping, and then that's it, you're done. So that's been the biggest issue for me, but even issues with tenancy as well. If it weren't for my support worker, I would have completely struggled with this flat. Like the very first issue we had was with the electricity. They wanted to charge me £150 per month based on the previous tenants, like earning workings or something, how much they would rack up. And I get £300 a month. That's it. I can't put it all into electricity. But thankfully, I was able to get my support worker to sort of talk me through like how to talk to them essentially, and have him be there when I needed to have those conversations and things like that. And we got it down. But I almost completely forgot about my water bill as well. Like I left that to the last possible day to actually set up that account and set that up. That could have gone horribly wrong. Like issues with procrastination.
It's hard.
Yeah, if these things weren't on a direct debit thing, like if they didn't automatically come out of my account, I'd be screwed just completely. I wouldn't be able to keep up properly. So it's things like that being in place are great, but not everyone has a support worker, you know?
Something like as simple as a direct debit has made your life much easier. And having that little bit of support wrapped around you makes your life a lot easier. And I think that's a great example when we're talking about the social model and how you can remove some barriers by little adjustments. And, it's not hard to say to someone, all right, well, I'm not going to send you, your electric bill in the post anymore. We're going to direct debit you X amount a month. So that's coming out. It's automatically done. The electric company's happy. You don't have to worry. And that straight away removed a barrier that, as I actually said, was making their life hard, making them concerned, worried, stressed, and all of that. And had that gone wrong, it would have made the electric company very concerned as well. So I think that's a great example of what we're talking about when we're saying about removing those barriers.
Yeah, it comes down to, if it's a lot of little problems, relatively, a lot of little adjustments can be made, and that's just sort of keeping up with it then, and then eventually you reach a balance where things are comfortable, ideally.
Yeah, and speaking of barriers, Ax, if you cast your mind back to when you were facing homelessness, what was it like when you were trying to get support?
I was lucky that I had the support of my brother, first of all. I was staying at his place for the several months in between getting my own sort of bed. And I thankfully had the support of my brother and my sister-in-law. So I don't entirely remember all the conversations that were had. And then I had someone from the hospital who was already been working with myself and my mum. He's like a youth worker kind of person. He already knew about some of the issues. I'd told him sort of to help get things moving in a way. And he'd helped me through COVID, going to stay with my other brother, things like that. So I had his support, and I believe it was him who did a lot of the sort of reaching out for me. I did have a social worker for a short period of time, but a lot of that's where some of the issues were then, was there wasn't much communication with him. I wasn't sure what was going on really at any moment in time. Even my brother and sister-in-law weren't given like a proper time scale. I mean, it's hard to know exactly when there'll be a bed available for me. Like it's hard to find a hostel around. It's always, you always need more. So I understand that, but there wasn't much communication about what would be offered, what would any sort of idea of the location beyond Cardiff. And it was the initial sort of communication wasn't great, even if it was coming through like another person for the sake of my own mental health. Really, it would have been very stressful otherwise to try and go reaching out to charities I'd never heard of, because I hadn't heard of Llamau before anything. I hadn't heard of End Youth Homelessness Cymru, any of them really. They aren't commonly advertised, I guess. Like you never see them coming out to schools, and that is maybe a bit off topic, but that's half the issue, in my opinion, is you get so many like assemblies in schools and they're never that relevant. They could be so much more relevant with issues like this. And just, yeah, having had someone, a poster even around the school, so that I know of the existence, that could have solved problems before they happened, essentially. But yeah, but in terms of like neurodivergence issues, communication was, and general overwhelm was sort of my biggest issue. Even when once I got into the hostel, then it was difficult to communicate with the staff there initially, things like that. Not any fault of theirs, not any fault of anyone's really, but between anxiety and not entirely knowing sort of what the deal was, like who's like the person I'm supposed to talk to, why is there a new person every day? It's a new environment and there's not a written out list of rules. I'd love it so much more if everything had a written out list of rules and procedures. It would make things so much easier.
Yeah, thank you, Axe. So, Nic, as someone that works within that system, that's obviously, trying to support these young people with their housing and so on, what are the challenges that you face and that you see the young people you support having to deal with?
I think for me, the overarching things is all young people will struggle with it. But I think when you're thinking of going through like developmental stages, and if you're doing that on top of it, and it's emotionally challenging for young people anyway. And then if you're hitting that, and then you are neurodivergent, and that you might not respond in a way that would be perceived as what would be normal within society, it can be overwhelming. People can want to run away from that. I mean, like shut down from that and not engage in it till it gets to a massive crisis point, so they won't go for help earlier, or they don't know where to go, they haven't got access to things like that. But I think it's things like you would maybe organize meetings and appointments, and then they wouldn't turn up and things like that. And it was very challenging for them because you knew that they were absolutely keen to engage because you'd had a conversation with them the day before, and then by the next day things would be completely forgotten. And I think we've had young people really struggling in busy supported accommodation where they're really struggling with that type of environment, where that if it'd been like an alternative or a smaller supported accommodation type place, they would have probably been better in that type of environment. But those places are few and far between. And I think sadly, neurodivergent young people have to fit within a really difficult system. People are in those environments for much longer than they were anticipated. So that can be really difficult. But again, it's all those things. Like it can be really challenging for somebody that finds communication difficult to phone services or to engage in those type of organisations, and it's all about that. It's all about who you've got to speak to. Is there a referral? Have you contacted this? Have you filled this form in? And it must feel overwhelming on top of, generally feeling overwhelming in those type of environments. So it's things like that that can be really difficult. And like I said, and then people then can react in different ways. They can shut down. They can overtly engage. I think the most important thing, and I think maybe Sean mentioned it very, very early on, is like neurodivergent people are extremely different. And you can have somebody with ASD and they can be two different types of people. They don't come like in a package box. Not everybody with ADHD behaves in this way, and not everybody with ASD behaves this way. Not everybody with, dyslexia. And I think that's something that we need to look at more as a society.
Fab. Just want to turn to the research, Sean, and ask what the research found were the main sort of challenges or barriers that the neurodivergent young people were facing when they were trying to access that support.
I think a lot came up around communication in various ways. Young people would struggle with the way that information was conveyed to them, people given information written in very technical legal language. I always remember one where they talk about being told that their duties under Section 73 of the Housing Wales Act has expired. They're now executing their Section 75 duty. And I've got a little flow chart on the office wall next to me, so I remember these when I'm reading through things to know what I'm talking about, what I'm reading. And if I've got that on the office wall to learn them and I'm paid to do that, I don't expect some 17 or 18-year-old going through the worst time of their life to be able to understand what some section of some Welsh Government Act actually means. So that's a major issue where people just don't understand how much of a barrier that kind of communication can be for people. And I think that would be true for all young people, but further complicated if it's a neurodivergent person, quite simply, if they're dyslexic and have a slightly harder time with written communication than their peers, that's going to be that extra barrier, let alone the fact it's written in legalese. Another issue that we came across was to do with the actual environment where people present to homelessness services. So we hear anecdotally about young people who turned up to a housing options office, walked into, big shiny glass building, corporate office of, somewhere county council. You could have just gone through the worst time of your life. And you add in that, it could be busy. It could be like a train station in there, brightly lit, loads of people coming and going, not knowing what's going on, being told all of this information in one big go. That's going to be overwhelming. And that's going to leave people frightened. It's going to leave people anxious. Like I say, that's going to be true of everyone, but it's going to be further complicated for neurodivergent young people. And that comes back to those negative stereotypes of how people might react to these. And, I think it's natural for people to be in sort of a really anxious state in these situations. And people are only going to react naturally in a flight or fight way to that. And I think that's a problem. And that's broadly a problem with youth homelessness services where people present, but it's further complicated by the neurodivergent elements of that. And when people do engage with these systems, it can be quite triggering of past traumas as well, especially if those are around engaging with services which haven't supported them, or being in a family environment perhaps where they weren't understood. It's going to add to people's pre-existing traumas, create new ones, and that's going to stick with them and make it harder for them to get back into that stable accommodation, as is the ideal for everyone. So I think that's a major issue, and one of the barriers that kept coming up about how people engage with these services and struggle to make their way through them into a better place, into a more stable form of accommodation.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Sean. So I'd like to turn to a slightly more positive note now as we kind of approach the end of the conversation. We've kind of touched on it a little bit. We know that it's not all bad. There is a lot of good practice that we're seeing across Wales. But I want to ask all of you really, can you think of any examples of good practice that you've seen, things that are already working well? Or if not, what do you think could be done to improve it and to make these services a little bit more accessible and neurodiversity friendly? And I'll start with you, Nicola.
Yeah, and I think we can do the huge things. I do think Welsh Government given priority to ASD, where everybody in local authorities, frontline staff have had ASD training, and now they're looking at on broader to incorporate neurodivergent other conditions as well, so all comorbidities. And I think, so things like that are absolutely fantastic. And I do think it's already started people talking on a broader level, so people are becoming more aware. A little bit like, trauma-informed services were when people are having trauma-informed training, etc. I think those type of things, when it comes through at that strategic level, can have real impact on the ground. On the flip side of that, we don't always have to do these massive things either. It can be things like, how can we best communicate with you? How can we best support you? Having those type of general questions with young people or whoever services that you're in. How can we best serve you? How can we best communicate with you? Just having those types of conversations, which is a very small thing, doesn't cost anything. There's not this massive strategic amount of fiscal money needs to be attached to a change of approach from a practitioner. And I think some of those things are happening now. But it doesn't cost anything to change your practice and change your approach. And I think that's where training, support, and things like that are really, really important.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nicola. Axe, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of what Nicola said. Essentially, it comes down to personalized care, reaching out however they may need, and asking what way works best for you. The most it's going to cost is maybe a little bit more time to find the right person to match or whatever, but there is so much more potential to help correctly and for a long-term effect if it's done right in the first place, even if it takes a little bit longer to ask all the right questions and make everyone the most comfortable. It's worth it in the end. Ultimately, I remember my best therapist as being the one who asked me, "Hey, would you rather we do this sat here, or would you rather we go for a walk, or go sit in the park, or do this?" And she gave me the options. She kept me informed about what we might be discussing, let me sort of lead the thing. And yes, that's how you're supposed to do therapy, but it's also a good thing to apply in general, is keeping the, I don't know what the right word is, client properly informed and involved in their own support, essentially. Even just, I don't know, for me personally, I prefer having things written down. I need a calendar at all times, like Nicola mentioned earlier, or I will forget things. So having my support worker write things on post-it notes that I could put up on my wall and know, yep, we're meeting on this time at this day. That simple. It was all I needed, and I would be there at the office ready. And that worked for me. It wouldn't necessarily work for someone else. So it's just about asking, essentially. And I realize that's difficult to do in a generalized sense. Like for certain institutions, that might be more difficult to implement, but there has to be a way. Ultimately, it's the best for everyone involved. Even people who aren't neurodivergent would benefit greatly from personalized care. And that I feel for some people is a point that needs to be emphasized. A lot of people worry that accessibility for one person will make it harder for them, which I've never understood, because it doesn't, quite simply. But sometimes it needs to be explained that just because there is an option for a ramp doesn't mean that the stairs aren't going to be there anymore if you want the stairs. And then that can be applied to so many things. And I think if a lot of people were less scared of accessibility, then things might get done a bit faster, maybe.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you guys for that. So I would like to ask you, as the final sort of thought of this podcast episode, imagine you wake up tomorrow in some parallel universe and you find out that you are now the First Minister of Wales. What is the first thing that you were going to put in place in order to, well, either prevent neurodivergent young people from becoming homeless in the first place, or to better be able to support them and help them when they do? We will start with you, Sean.
Yeah. A scary thought giving me that much power. I think what I'd want to do is really pull this back way before we're talking about homelessness and start embedding a lot of the principles we've talked about throughout this. Services that are designed to be accessible by default, with that extra bit on top where you have the conversation with the people and figure out how you can adjust to suit their needs specifically, and embed that throughout everything that's done in society, all forms of public services. So not just doing, this shouldn't just be at the front door of the housing options. This should be in the primary school, the first place they come into contact with these services. It should be in the hospitals. It should be culturally and structurally embedded in public services in Wales and beyond. And I think that's really what we need to be doing, which I know is a very big picture way of looking at this, and it's not the simple, straightforward task. But this isn't a simple, straightforward task. Eradicating ableist structures from society isn't going to be easy. So I think if we are thinking about it that broadly, I think that's what I would start doing, is pulling things apart and seeing what we can do to change at that very early stage. So this isn't just at the crisis point, it's embedded, so people have that much easier time. And, you cut off the flow of young people ending up in homelessness in the first place.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sean. Nicola, what would you do?
Yeah, well, I'd certainly love that, Sean, for sure. And again, and I think it has to be like that, though, doesn't it? I think it really does need to be like that. I think what I would do is give things that strength in, having it built formally into policy, informally built into guidance, formally built into good practice stuff that's going out there. And I think if you do that, and it is given clout, it can have massive influence on. It's very difficult out there, isn't there? Do you know what I mean? I mean, what I would like to do is have housing first everywhere, loads more money in CAMs. If I could go on forever, But I think, what you've got to do is it's got to be built in that it has to be given priority, and that has to be legislative priority, policy priority, where it is given a duty to local authorities to take this seriously, to look at practice, to make sure it's inclusive, etc. Organisations have to show that they are being inclusive, that they are incorporating it. When you think about what we just said earlier, that everybody will benefit from it, it shouldn't be such a difficult task, I think, to implement. But it's the will comes from, making that sort of precedent, really. It's like Wales is saying, we're going to be the first neurodiverse friendly country in the world, something like that, and really putting itself out on the map and trying to lead it. And we are a leader in certain things in Wales anyway. And I think why can't we be that, take that mantle forward? You know what I mean? Let's be the leader, in Europe or internationally, and saying what can we do as a country to be the first, inclusive neurodivergent country in the world. Why not? Isn't they? Got to start somewhere. Some countries got to be the first. Why not us?
I love the ambition, Nic. Absolutely love it. And finally, Axe, what would you do as First Minister?
So I wish you'd started with me, because Sean, in a far more eloquent way, completely took my answer, and then Nicola is a very similar answer to my second answer. But
Sorry.
It comes down, I guess, to training and awareness, essentially, and ensuring that young people are aware of what they can access, what these services can do for them. And then when they get there, ensuring that those services are right for them, and that everyone involved is fully trained, fully aware, because it's stressful for staff as well to they're trying to talk to someone and not sure if they're doing it right. I remember the practitioners meeting that we had, and that was probably the most common feedback, was they were worried that they didn't know how to help and they wanted to help. So proper training and just getting the word out that services are available, they are out there, willing and able to help, and they know how to help properly, rather than helping a little bit, then leaving you alone for a month and suddenly you're right back where you started. Yeah.
Brilliant. What a great point to end on. Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining me today. It was a really interesting conversation, and you all gave some really insightful answers. So thank you. Before I let you go, is there anything anyone would like to add? Anything you wanted to say we didn't get a chance to?
Read the report, is what I would say. Take that opportunity. It's really accessible. I think that's something that's really important. Again, when you think about research, etc., you think, this highbrow thing. It's not. It's very, very accessible, and it would mean something to you if you read it. It's really accessible. So I think it'd be really important for people to read it.
We will, absolutely. Thank you for that plug, Nic. That's perfect. Thank you so much. ADREF is produced by End Youth Homelessness Cymru and Upod. It's edited by Aled Jones from Upod. The music is July by John Patitucci. If you enjoy our show and want to support us, please leave us a rating. It helps a lot. If you'd like to learn more about EYHC and our work, you can head to our website, endyouthhomelessness.cymru, or search End Youth Homelessness Cymru on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn and X. Diolch am wrando, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.